The woman who tells this story is 63 years old. She sits in a cabin she built with her own hands on a ridge in eastern Kentucky, and outside the window, the December frost is doing what December frost has always done in these hills, settling over everything, like a white judgment, slow and without mercy. There is a fire in the stone hearth. There is a barthel on the mantel above it, worn thin from 40 years of sharpening the handle dark with use. There is a small wooden box beside the knife, and the woman has not opened it today, though she has looked at it twice since morning. Her name is Clara Voss. She does not look like a woman who survived something. She looks like a woman who decided to survive, and that is a different thing entirely. The distinction matters. It is the whole story, in fact, if you want to understand it before she tells it herself. The young woman sitting across from her is named Nora Finch. She works for the Elkhorn Courier, a small paper in the valley below, and she has been trying to write this story for 2 years. People in Elkhorn talk about Clara Voss the way they talk about the ridge she lives on, with a kind of respectful distance, aware that there is something up there that doesn't bend to ordinary weather. Nora has finally been invited to come up and listen. She has her notebook open. She has not written anything yet. Clara looks at the fire for a long time before she speaks. She looks at the knife, then she begins. You want to know about the tree, Nora Finch? Everyone wants to know about the tree, but to understand the tree, you have to understand the house I came from. And to understand the house, you have to understand what it means when someone tells you that you are lucky to be fed. You have to understand what 6 years of that word lucky does to a person, what it carves out of them, what it leaves behind when it is finally finished. I was 12 years old when Edna Hartwell took me in. That is the word that was used. Took me in, as though I were a stray cat that had appeared on the porch cold and inconvenient, and she had made the gracious decision to open the door. My parents had died that spring. My father first from a fever that moved through the valley like something with a purpose, and my mother 6 weeks after from grief or exhaustion, or some combination of the two, that the doctor didn't have a proper name for. I was left with nothing. No family, no money, no claim on any piece of the world I was standing in. Edna Hartwell was the wife of a prosperous farmer named Howard. They had a daughter, Ruth, who was 10 years old and growing. They had a farmhouse with 5 rooms and a parlor and a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and rendered lard. They attended the Baptist church in Elkhorn every Sunday without fail, and Edna Hartwell was known in the congregation as a woman of strong Christian character. She read the Bible every morning at the kitchen table. She kept a wooden ruler in the drawer beside the stove. These two facts are not unconnected. The arrangement was explained to me simply the day I arrived with nothing but the clothes on my back and a small cloth bag that had belonged to my mother. I would have a roof over my head and food in my belly. In exchange, I would help with the household work. It was presented as charity. It was presented as a gift freely given. And the appropriate response to a gift freely given is gratitude. And gratitude means you do not complain, and you do not ask questions, and you do not speak unless you are spoken to. I was 12 years old. I did not know that there was another word for what this was. I learned it later, slowly, the way you learn most things that matter, not from a book, but from the accumulating weight of days. The room they gave me was off the kitchen behind the wood stove. It had been used for storing flour sacks and extra canning jars, and it still smelled like both when I moved in. The bed was a pallet on the floor with a corn husk mattress that had been passed down through 3 generations of use and never once replaced. The single window faced north, and in the winter, the cold came through the glass as though the glass wasn't there at all. I was given a quilt that had more patches than original fabric. I was told this was generous. I woke before dawn every morning to start the fire. I cooked the breakfast, cleaned the kitchen, fed the chickens, hauled water from the well, scrubbed the floors on my hands and knees every Saturday until the wood was pale from washing. I mended clothes and salted meat and churned butter and gathered eggs in every season, regardless of weather. I worked until dinner was on the table, and then I waited until the family had finished before I ate what was left. Sometimes there was not much left. I did not complain. Howard Hartwell was not a cruel man in the way that some men are cruel deliberately with satisfaction. He was cruel in a quieter way, the way of men who watch something wrong happening and look at the floor and say nothing, because the cost of saying something is higher than the cost of silence. He was a big man, soft-spoken, who spent most of his time in the barn or the fields and seemed to move through the house with the careful energy of someone trying not to disturb things. He never struck me. He never raised his voice. He also never once in 6 years intervened when Edna raised hers, or when she raised the ruler. The ruler was for specific failures: a dinner that was 15 minutes late, eggs gathered too slowly, a floor that Edna had determined was not adequately clean upon her inspection, even if I had spent the whole morning on it. The strikes were precise and businesslike, the way Edna Hartwell did most things efficiently without waste, with a certain brisk confidence that what she was doing was correct and righteous and entirely within the natural order of things. Afterwards, she would return to whatever she had been doing. She never seemed angry exactly. She seemed resolved. I learned very early not to cry in front of her. She interpreted tears as manipulation. There is something that happens to a child who grows up being told that her pain is a performance, something that goes quiet in a very deep place, like a door closing on a room that doesn't get opened again for a long time. I was not broken by those years. I want to be clear about that. But something in me learned to go underground, to move through the days on the surface while keeping whatever actually mattered hidden below where no one could reach it and take it. You learn to live small. You learn to occupy the minimum amount of space. You learn that the safest version of yourself is the version that wants nothing, expects nothing, and gives no one anything to use against you. 6 years of that education leaves marks, not all of them visible. Ruth Hartwell was not her mother. I want to be clear about that too, because Ruth is part of this story, and the part she plays is complicated, and she deserves to be understood correctly. Ruth was a gentle child, somewhat timid with her father's soft manner and her mother's sharp eyes, and she existed in that house the way privileged children often exist in the presence of those who serve them, not unkindly but with a fundamental incuriosity about the inner life of the person doing the serving. She did not think of me as a slave because she did not think of me very much at all. I was part of the furniture of her childhood. Useful, present, not quite real. But Ruth had books. Ruth had a shelf of books in her room that she had accumulated over years of birthdays and Christmases: geography books, a history of the American states, 3 novels, a collection of nature essays, and a Bible of her own that she almost never opened. She was not an avid reader. The books sat on the shelf primarily as objects, markers of a certain kind of household that owned books, and Ruth moved past them daily without much notice. I noticed them every time I cleaned her room. I began to read them in the small hours when the house was dark and everyone was sleeping, taking one book at a time, returning it before morning, reading by the light of a single tallow candle stub I had saved from the kitchen trash. I read slowly because I had to. My schooling had been thin, 2 years at the county schoolhouse before my parents died, but I improved over time the way you improve at anything you do every day, because the hunger for it is greater than the fear of being caught. One of Ruth's books was a collection of natural history essays. A chapter on indigenous peoples of the Ohio Valley described in brief and somewhat condescending terms how the Shawnee constructed their winter shelters, the direction of the opening relative to the prevailing wind, the placement of stones to redirect heat inward, the use of layered natural materials to separate a sleeping body from the frozen ground. I read that chapter 3 times. I did not know then why it lodged itself so firmly in my memory. I know now. The other book that mattered was a thin volume on practical woodcraft, the kind of book sold to farmers and hunters that explained in plain language how to read weather signs, how to find water on unfamiliar ground, which plants were edible, in which seasons, how to make a fire produce maximum heat from minimum fuel. I read that book 4 times over 3 years, returning it each morning before Ruth woke, and what I absorbed from it was less specific instruction than a general orientation. The understanding that survival in the natural world is not a matter of luck or exceptional ability, but of attention. You pay attention to what is available. You work with what exists rather than mourning what doesn't. You do not waste energy on conditions you cannot change. You address the problem in front of you with the materials in your hands. At the time, I thought I was reading it because I was hungry for any knowledge I could get. Later, I understood I was reading it because some part of me already knew it would be necessary. The 6th year was the same as the first 5 in most respects, except that I was 18 now, and Ruth was 16, and Ruth was of the age when a girl requires her own proper room. Not a storage closet in the kitchen, a real room. With a door that closed and a window that faced south and enough space for the small vanity table her mother had promised her for her upcoming birthday. The room behind the wood stove had a south-facing window. I was informed of this in October. Edna Hartwell came to me on a Tuesday morning when I was in the kitchen making biscuit dough, and she told me in the same tone she used to discuss the weather or the price of flour that I had until the end of the week to make arrangements. The boarding house in Elkhorn might take me on. I was not pretty, but I worked hard enough, and that was the kind of quality that kept a boarding house running. She placed a small cloth sack on the counter beside the dough. 50 cents, 6 years of labor. 50 cents. She went back to the parlor. I heard the chair scrape and then the sound of her Bible being opened, the soft rustle of thin paper turning, and then silence. I stood at the counter for a long time with my hands in the dough. I thought about 6 years. I thought about every morning I had woken before the light to build a fire in a house that was not mine, in a kitchen that was not mine, so that a family that was not mine could wake to warmth they had not earned. I thought about the bruises that had taken weeks to fade, about the meals I had cooked and not been allowed to eat hot, about the room barely larger than a closet where I had slept for 6 years on a mattress that smelled of the 3 generations of other people's bodies that had compressed it before mine. I thought about 50 cents. Then I finished the dough, shaped the biscuits, and put them in the oven, because that was the kind of person 6 years had made me, a person who finishes the biscuits. The morning I left was a Friday. The frost was still white on the ground, and my breath hung in the cold air, and the sky had the pale gray color of a sky that is thinking about something worse. Edna met me at the door. She handed me the flour sack, my clothes, 2 changes, both worn through in multiple places, and the 50 cents in a small paper fold. She did not say goodbye. She said good luck, which is what people say when they want you to understand that what happens to you now is entirely your own concern. Howard was somewhere behind her in the house. I could hear him moving in the kitchen. He did not come to the door. I had not expected him to. Ruth was at the upstairs window. I saw her when I turned to go, her face close to the glass, one hand raised, not quite in a wave, but in something that wanted to be a wave and lost its nerve halfway to completion. I looked at her for a moment. She was 16 years old, and she had never done me any particular harm, and she had never done me any particular good either. And the space between those two things had been my whole life for 6 years. I turned away from her. I walked down the dirt road toward the valley. I walked for 1 mile. The road curved south at the bottom of the hill where it met the wider track that led into Elkhorn. I had been to Elkhorn 3 times in 6 years, always on an errand, always with Edna present. I knew the boarding house was on the main street, a white building with a porch run by a widow named something I had already forgotten. I knew that if I went there, I would have a bed and possibly work and possibly a future that looked more or less like the past 6 years, arranged differently, but fundamentally the same. Someone else's floors, someone else's hours, someone else's assessment of my value. I stood at the fork in the road for a long good time. The forest started at the tree line above the road, climbing the ridge in dense stands of oak and hickory and hemlock, the leaves mostly gone now, the branches making their winter architecture against the pale sky. I had never been into those woods. There was no reason to go into them. They were not a place you went with any practical purpose. They were just the forest that covered the ridge above the valley, old and indifferent and cold. I turned off the road and started walking uphill. I want to explain this decision because it is not the decision of a person in despair, though it might look that way from the outside. I was not walking into the forest to die. I was walking into the forest because the alternative, the boarding house, the widow whose name I had forgotten, another family's charity, felt in that moment like something I would not survive in a different and more complete way. A death of a kind that doesn't show up in the county records. The death of whatever was left inside me that was still, despite everything, mine. If I was going to be cold, I thought I would be cold on my own terms. If I was going to be hungry, it would be because the forest was hungry, not because someone had decided I wasn't worth the extra portion. I was 18 years old, and I had 50 cents and a flour sack of worn-out clothes and a body that knew how to work but had no idea how to survive. And I walked uphill into the Kentucky woods in October of 1886 with what I now recognize, looking back, as the most important thing I own, and the only thing Edna Hartwell had never managed to touch: spite. Pure, clean, absolute spite. Not hatred that is a different fuel, hotter and less reliable. Spite is colder than hatred. Spite is the determination to outlast something, to still be standing when the thing that dismissed you has finished falling. I did not know that then in those terms, but I felt it in my chest like a coal that wouldn't go out, and I walked toward the tree line and the coal burned and kept me moving. The first day I found water, which is the thing for all other things. A creek ran down through the hollow below the ridge, narrow and fast, still clear in October, before the first hard freeze. I drank from it lying on my stomach, and the cold of it ached in my teeth. And I didn't care because I was thirsty in a way that wipes out all other concerns. I refilled the small tin cup I had in the flour sack, a cup that had been mine for 6 years, the one thing in that house that was formally designated as belonging to me, and I kept walking uphill. I slept that first night under a rock overhang I found near the top of the first ridge, curled on my side with the flour sack pressed against my chest for warmth. The cold was serious, but not yet deadly. This was early October, the deep freezes still 6 weeks away, and I woke stiff but alive with the first light coming gray through the trees. The second day I found berries, the last of the autumn crop, small and tart, and I ate until my fingers were stained purple and my stomach cramped from the acidity. I found 3 walnut trees and collected what had fallen, cracking them against a stone, eating the bitter meat inside. I kept moving because stopping meant the cold had a better chance at me, and because uphill still felt like direction, and direction felt like intention, and intention was what separated survival from its alternative. The third day I had nothing. I sat down on a fallen log in the middle of the morning, and I recognized clearly and without drama that I was in serious trouble. My feet were wet. The thin dress I was wearing, appropriate for October work around a farmhouse, was not appropriate for October nights in the hills. My hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with not enough food for too many days. I sat on that log and I looked at the trees around me, and I thought with a kind of exhausted honesty that I had made a decision that might have been a mistake. That was when Ezra Malone stepped out from behind a hemlock tree 30 feet away and looked at me. He was a thin old man, 70 or thereabouts, dressed in clothes so thoroughly patched that the original fabric was largely theoretical. His beard was white and wild, the kind of beard that grows when a man has stopped caring about what anyone thinks. And his eyes were bright and focused in the way of someone who has spent decades entirely in their own company and has stopped performing attention for others. Everything he directed at you was real, because there was no audience left to perform for. He stood still and looked at me the way a man looks at something he has been watching for a while and has already formed his conclusions about. "You're in trouble," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know it," I said. He was quiet a moment. "How long since you ate properly?" "Day before yesterday," I said. "There were berries yesterday." He made a sound that might have been a short laugh. "Berries won't carry you through the first frost. You've got people, family, numb, a place you're going, no." He looked at me for a long time with those focused eyes, and I had the distinct feeling that I was being assessed against some criteria I didn't have access to. Not unkindly, but honestly the way you assess the structural integrity of something before deciding whether to trust it with weight. Then he said, "I want to tell you something. 3 days ago, I watched you come up the road and turn into the trees instead of going toward town. I've been watching you since." I didn't say anything. 20 years ago, he said, there was a man in a situation something like yours, came up into these hills running from something. I found him on the second day, bad shape, and I made the mistake of helping him too fast. Brought him straight to what I'm going to show you. He lasted 2 nights. Panicked. Went back down to the valley and froze in a ditch before he made it to the road. He paused. "I've thought about that man a long time." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I watched you for 3 days," he said, "before you sat down on that log, and you didn't go back." This is the thing about Ezra Malone that I did not understand until many years later, after he was dead, and I had time to think about what he had actually given me. He had a past. He had a past the way most people who end up alone in the hills have a past, not as a criminal or a coward, but as someone who had been on the wrong side of a decision made by a person with more power than conscience. He had owned land, a small farm 15 miles east along the ridge. He had a wife and 2 sons. The farm sat on ground that a county judge had determined would be necessary for the expansion of a particular road contract, a contract that would benefit a particular set of investors, who were also, it turned out, personal acquaintances of the particular judge. Ezra refused to sell. The legal proceedings that followed were conducted with the quiet efficiency of a system that knows its own outcome in advance. He lost the land. He lost the farm. The wife took the boys to her sister's people in Virginia, and Ezra, at the age of 51, found himself with nothing and no reason to be where other people could find him. He had been in these hills for 20 years when I sat down on that log. He told me this as we walked in the flat and unfussy way of someone who has processed a thing so many times it has lost its power to wound. He told me about the land and the judge and the road contract. He told me about his sons, who would be grown men now, and how he had not seen them since they were 7 and 9 years old. He did not ask me about the Hartwells. He seemed to understand without asking that my particular version of the story was different in its details, but identical in its shape. Someone with power had decided that someone without it didn't matter. He had no consolation to offer for that. He didn't try to offer any. What he offered instead was the tree. It stood in a hollow about 2 miles from where he'd found me, in a section of forest that felt older than the surrounding woods. The trees larger, the shadows deeper the ground, more layered with decades of accumulated leaf fall. The white oak was enormous. The trunk was wider than the span of a large man's arms, and then wider still, the bark deeply furrowed in gray, the bare branches spreading overhead against the October sky like the framework of something built by something far more patient than anything human. But the tree was hollow. Some old injury, lightning, or disease, Ezra thought, maybe both at different times, had eaten out the heartwood over what must have been decades, leaving a cavity inside the living wood that the tree had simply grown around and incorporated into itself the way living things incorporate damage when they have no alternative. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a person's shoulders. But inside, the space opened up into a chamber roughly 6 feet across and close to 8 feet tall, the walls smooth with age, the wood darkened to the color of old iron. The air inside was noticeably warmer than the air outside. Ezra stood at the entrance and watched me put my hand against the interior wall. The wood was warm to the touch, holding heat slowly absorbed, slowly released. "Oak does this," he said. "The walls are 2 feet thick in some places. Wind cannot get to you in there. Rain cannot reach you." I spent 2 winters in that tree when I first came to these hills before I had the cabin built. He was quiet a moment. Would have spent more if the spring weren't so far. He pointed downhill through the trees. "Quarter mile that way. Doesn't freeze even in the worst cold." I ran my hand along the wall again. 3 centuries of a tree growing around its own wound. "Why are you showing me this?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the tree, then at me, and his expression was the expression of someone measuring a distance they have crossed before and know the cost of. "Because I recognize what you are wearing on your face," he said finally. "I wore it once a long time ago. And because there is nobody else who is going to help you, and I am too old to watch another person die when I know where they could live." He reached into his coat. He brought out a knife, a hunting knife with a blade worn thin from long years of sharpening and a handle of dark wood smooth from use. He held it out to me. "This is what I can give you. The rest you will have to find yourself." I took the knife. It was heavier than it looked. I have thought many times since about why it felt so heavy, and I think it is because it was the first thing anyone had given me in 6 years without an attached condition. No expectation, no debt, no performance of gratitude required in return. Just a knife held out in an old man's hand because he had decided I was worth the giving. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You have maybe 3 weeks before the real cold comes. That tree will keep you alive, but only if you make it ready." He turned to go, then stopped. "One more thing. The Hartwell farm is in the valley below that ridge. If you can see their chimney smoke in the morning, they can see yours if you're careless. Build your fires small. Burn them hot. Wet wood makes smoke. Dry wood makes heat. Don't forget the difference." He walked into the trees. I watched until I couldn't see him anymore. I heard later from a trapper I met in March when the worst was over that Ezra Malone had been found dead in his cabin in January. Frozen in his chair, the trapper said, like he'd just sat down for a moment and decided to stay. I have thought about that a great deal over the years. I have thought about the fact that he went home to his cabin after pointing me toward the tree, knowing that his own wood supply was running low, knowing that January was coming. He gave me his knife and went home to his cabin and sat down in his chair. He gave me what he had and kept nothing back. I did not know any of that when I stood at the entrance of the hollow tree and watched him disappear into the forest. What I knew was this: the air inside the tree was warmer than the air outside. The walls were 2 feet thick. The spring was a quarter-mile downhill and didn't freeze. I put my hand one more time against the interior wall. The wood was warm. I stepped inside. The hollow was dark. The entrance was narrow enough that the gray October daylight barely reached the center of the space, and in the dimness I could see the curve of the interior walls, the texture of wood that had been growing and aging for 3 centuries, the thick mat of old leaves and debris on the floor. The smell was deep and organic old wood leaf mold, the cold mineral smell of something that has been enclosed for a very long time. I stood there in the dark and I breathed. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches of the oaks on the ridge above, a sound like running water. And somewhere down in the valley, the thin smoke from the Hartwell chimney was rising in the still morning air, which meant the fire was banked low, which meant Edna Hartwell was sitting at the kitchen table with her Bible open and her wooden ruler in the drawer, and her daughter's room newly vacated and ready to receive its proper occupant. I was somewhere no one would think to look. I was somewhere no one knew about. For the first time since I was 12 years old, 6 years, 2 months, and some number of days, no one knew where I was. No one was coming to find me. No one would be opening a door I was behind to assess whether I had been sufficiently useful to merit my continued existence. The tree was dark. The tree was old. The tree had been hollow for longer than any living person could remember, growing around its own damage for centuries, still standing, still alive, the bark gray and deeply furrowed and unyielding in the October cold. I was 18 years old and I had a knife and 50 cents and 3 weeks before the real cold came. I sat down on the floor of the tree with my back against the warm, curved wall, and for the first time in 6 years, I let myself think not about what needed to be done, not about what was required of me, but about what I was going to choose. The distinction I was beginning to understand mattered more than anything else. It was the whole story. The preparation began the next morning before the light was fully in the sky. Clara Voss, 18 years old, alone on a ridge in eastern Kentucky with a hunting knife and 50 cents, and 3 weeks before the killing cold arrived, did not allow herself the luxury of fear. Fear was something she had learned to store carefully in a contained place where it could generate heat without setting the whole structure alight. What she allowed herself instead was inventory. What she had, what she needed, what the gap between those two things required of her. She had the knife. She had the flour sack with 2 changes of worn clothing, a tin cup, and a small length of cord she had used to tie her hair back for 6 years. She had 50 cents in a paper fold she kept inside her boot. She had a body that knew how to work hands, that knew how to move through cold mornings without being told twice, in a memory that had stored without knowing why, a description from one of Ruth Hartwell's books about how certain peoples of the Ohio Valley built their winter shelters, the direction of the opening relative to the prevailing wind, the placement of stones to redirect heat inwards, the use of layered natural materials to separate a sleeping body from the frozen ground. She had 3 weeks. She started with the floor. The leaf litter inside the tree was old and compressed, years of accumulation pressed down into a damp mat that held moisture like a sponge and would steal heat from a sleeping body as efficiently as any open window. Clara dragged it out by the armful, working until the floor of the hollow was bare dark wood, slightly curved at the center, where the tree's interior had settled over centuries. Then she went into the forest and began collecting. Fresh fallen leaves came first, gathered in the folds of the extra dress from the flour sack, carried back in load after load until the floor was covered 2 feet deep in dry oak leaves that smelled like tannin and cold air and the faint sweetness of things recently alive. Then pine boughs from the hemlock stand on the upper ridge. She cut them carefully with the hunting knife, choosing branches from the lower portions of the trees where the needles were thickest and most waxy, understanding, without being told that the waxy surface was what mattered, that it would shed moisture rather than absorbing it. She layered the pine boughs over the leaves and pressed them down with her weight to test the loft. The bed she was constructing would trap the heat of her body and hold it through the night, not perfectly, Not warmly in any comfortable sense, but adequately. Adequately was the word she kept returning to. Not comfort, not warmth in the way a farmhouse was warm. Adequate warmth. Enough to maintain the core temperature of a human body through a Kentucky winter night. That was the target, everything aimed at that single threshold. Adequate meant alive. Alive was enough. The second task was the walls. The entrance to the hollow was narrow, barely wide enough for her shoulders, and this was protection in itself, a natural baffle against the direct entry of wind. But there were gaps. Along the upper portion of the trunk where old bark had split away from the wood beneath cracks, ran upward into the tree's interior hairline fractures that would carry cold air in the steady and invisible way that small things carry large consequences. On the first genuinely cold night she had spent in the hollow, the third night when the temperature had dropped sharply after sunset, she had felt the breath of those cracks on her face while the rest of the chamber held its warmth, and she had understood immediately what needed to be done. She went to the creek. The creek bank in October was still soft in the shaded sections, the clay beneath the leaf layer dark and workable, and she dug it out with a flat stone and carried it back to the tree in the tin cup, making trip after trip until she had enough to work with. She mixed the clay with dry grass she pulled from the open ground above the ridge, working it with her hands until she had a crude mortar, gray-brown and dense, that held its shape when she pressed it into a crack and released it slowly without crumbling. She packed every gap she could find. She worked from the bottom up, sealing the base of the interior, first where cold air was heaviest, then moving upward along the walls to where the cracks narrowed to thin lines. The clay dried slowly in the cold, but it dried contracting slightly and gripping the wood on either side of each crack, and when she pressed her palm flat against the sealed sections, the following morning she could feel that the breath was gone. The entrance she addressed last. From a dead elm she found downslope, she pried a section of outer bark, a piece roughly the size of a small door, still intact and fairly rigid, not yet softened by rot. She cut 2 lengths of twisted vine from the creek bank willows and used them to hinge the bark over the entrance, opening hanging it so it rested against the tree's exterior and could be pulled inward by a cord looped through a small notch she cut at the bottom edge. Inside, pulling the cord drew the flap tight. Outside, a second length of vine tucked into a crack beside the entrance held the flap closed. She tested it a dozen times. Open, closed, open, closed. The difference in air temperature inside when the flap was closed was immediate and unmistakable. She stood inside the sealed hollow in the late afternoon of what she believed to be day 5 and allowed herself for the first time a single thought that was not purely tactical. This might work. The fire was the hardest part, and it was the part that almost killed her. Not directly, not in the way that cold or starvation kills you directly with a physical mechanism you can feel. The fire almost killed her with visibility, which is a different kind of danger, one that operates through consequences rather than immediate cause. On the 8th day in the late afternoon, she built her first real fire. She had chosen a site just outside the entrance to the hollow, a shallow depression in the ground. She had deepened further with a stick lined with stones she carried from the creek bed, each stone roughly the same size, selected for flatness on the top surface. The design came from the natural history book she had read 3 times in Ruth's room, adapted to what she could see in front of her. The stones would absorb heat and radiate it inward through the open entrance. The depression would contain the coals. The overhead canopy of bare branches would disperse the smoke. She used birch bark for tinder. It catches fast and burns hot and dry, split wood from a downed oak she had found on the east slope, aged and gray and thoroughly seasoned. The fire started on the 3rd attempt, and she felt the first real heat she had felt in 8 days wash across her face, and for a moment she simply sat and received it, eyes closed, letting the warmth reach places the cold had occupied for so long it had begun to feel permanent. She opened her eyes. The smoke was rising in a thick gray column straight up through the still evening air. She could see it clearly from where she sat, which meant it could be seen. She looked toward the south, down through the trees, toward the valley below. The Hartwell farm was not visible from this exact position. A spur of the ridge blocked the direct line of sight, but she knew from the view she had from the open ground above that the farm's eastern field faced this slope of the ridge. She knew that a column of smoke rising above the tree line on a still evening would be visible to anyone standing in that field and looking uphill. She pulled the wood out of the fire, one piece at a time, and buried the coals under the displaced soil. She sat in the dark afterward and thought. It took her 2 more days of failure to understand what Ezra had meant. Wet wood makes smoke. Dry wood makes heat. She had thought she understood. She had used dry wood. She had selected it carefully. But there is dry and there is dry, and what she had burned was merely dry to the touch, not dry in its interior. The moisture remaining in incompletely seasoned wood is not visible. It reveals itself only in combustion, rising as steam that combines with the particulate of burning and produces the visible gray column she had seen lifting off her fire like a signal flag. She needed wood that had been dead and exposed for at least 2 full seasons. By the end of the second week, she had a system that worked a fire small enough to be managed with 1 arm's worth of wood burning hot enough to heat the stones and radiate warmth inward through the entrance for 2 hours after the last piece had been consumed. The smoke dispersed by branch cover and wind into something indistinguishable from early morning mist to anyone looking uphill from the valley below. She would bank the coals at night, burying them in ash, and in the morning she would find them still alive, in a dim orange pulse under gray, and she would blow them back to flame with one careful breath and rebuild the fire before the chill of the hollow had fully reasserted itself. She had no water to boil. But the principle held. The first snow came on the 14th of November. She knew the date because she had been marking days on the interior wall of the hollow with a thin stick dipped in creek mud, a vertical line for each day, a diagonal slash through every seventh. She did not know the day of the week this corresponded to and did not particularly care. What she tracked was elapsed time and approaching cold, and on the 14th of November, both of those things arrived together with the first snowfall. It came in the night quiet and without announcement, and she woke to a world that had gone entirely white and silent. The hollow was warmer than it had any right to be, the thick oak walls having absorbed the previous day's fire heat, and held it through the night the way they had been holding and releasing heat for 3 centuries. She lay in her pine bough bed and listened to the silence and understood for the first time fully and in her body rather than just in her mind what Ezra had given her. Outside, the temperature had dropped below freezing and would not rise above it again until March. Inside the hollow, she was still alive. On a morning in November in a Kentucky winter that was already sharpening towards something serious, that was the whole of what mattered. She had food enough for perhaps 10 days' roots she had dug from the creek bank, a store of walnuts and hickory nuts cracked and shelled and kept in a folded piece of her extra dress, a small collection of dried berries pressed hard by their own sugar into something that resembled nothing edible, but tasted at need like something that had once been fruit. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough, but it was what she had, and what she had was what she worked with. On the 19th of November, she found the package. She had gone out before first light to check the fire pit and collect more seasoned wood from the downslope cache she had established, moving quietly through 6 inches of new snow that had fallen overnight. On her return, she stopped. At the base of the hollow oak, between two of the great roots that rose from the ground, like the buttresses of something built rather than grown, there was a small bundle wrapped in rough cloth. She stood and looked at it for a long time without approaching. She looked into the trees in every direction. Nothing moved, no tracks in the snow except her own. She picked up the bundle and went inside. It contained a piece of salt-cured pork, roughly a pound, wrapped in paper and then in the cloth. And beneath the pork, a coiled length of braided cord heavier and better made than anything she could have produced herself. There was no note, no mark, no indication of origin. She sat with the bundle in her lap and the bark door pulled closed and the faint warmth of the previous night's coals still in the air, and she turned the cloth over in her hands, looking for anything that would tell her who had come to this ridge in the night and left something at the base of her tree without announcing themselves. She could not determine it. She thought about Amos Calloway, the trapper who ran lines in these hills, whom she had seen once at a distance moving along the ridge above. It could have been him. It could have been anyone who moved through these woods regularly enough to have noticed signs of her presence, a footprint in mud near the creek, a section of bark pried from the elm, the carefully disturbed ground around her fire pit. But there was something about the smallness of the bundle that felt specific. The pork was enough for a person alone, not the generous portion of a trapper sharing a good hunt, but the careful portion of someone who had estimated correctly. The cord was exactly the kind of practical addition someone would include if they had thought carefully about what a person alone in the woods in November most needed beyond food. Someone had thought carefully. She put the pork in the coldest corner of the hollow, where the temperature outside the walls kept the interior near freezing, a natural larder, and she coiled the cord beside the knife on the flat stone she used as a shelf. Speculation was a luxury for later. Salt pork meant protein, and protein meant heat, and heat meant another week of adequate. She did not know until March who had left it. December came with a seriousness of purpose that the November cold had only hinted at. The temperature dropped to levels she had no instrument to measure, but calibrated by effect by how quickly the water in her tin cup froze solid if she left it more than an arm's reach, from the banked coals by how fast the exposed skin of her face went numb when she opened the bark door by the sound the trees made in the deep cold nights. A rifle crack, sound irregular and close as the sap froze and expanded, inside the wood, the forest speaking in the language of extremity. She had been startled by it the first time. By December, she had cataloged it into the ordinary music of the ridge, the way you accommodate any sound that comes often enough to lose its novelty. She lost weight steadily. She could feel it in the way her clothing hung in the new sharpness of her own hip bones against the pine boughs, when she turned in her sleep in a lightheadedness that came in the late afternoon when the day's food had been metabolized and there was nothing behind it. She was not starving. She was hungry, in a sustained and ordinary way, the kind of hunger that becomes the baseline condition of your existence, rather than an acute event. She ate twice a day small amounts, nothing more than she had to, because what she had was finite, and the winter was not. She thought about food constantly. She thought about the biscuits she had made every morning in the Hartwell kitchen, the ones she had never been allowed to eat hot, only the ones left over from the family's breakfast cold and slightly hard by the time she got to them. She thought about them now with a longing so intense it had a physical character, a hollow ache behind the sternum that had nothing to do with affection for the Hartwells and everything to do with the pure biochemistry of caloric deprivation. There were worse thoughts available to her. She did not entertain them. Instead, she worked. She checked her snares cord loops she had set along the routes where she had observed squirrels traveling before they went deep into their winter cover and found them mostly empty in December, but not always. A squirrel caught and cleaned and cooked over the fire pit was 3 days of protein. She treated each one as a gift that required acknowledgement through complete use, the meat eaten, the skin dried, the bones, boiled in the tin cup for whatever remained in them. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be wasted. Waste was a luxury available to people who had more than they needed, and she had never been one of those people and was certainly not one now. From the open ground above the hollow on clear mornings when the snow was firm enough to walk on without breaking through, she could see the Hartwell farm in the valley below. She went there sometimes to check her bearings to remind herself of the distance between her ridge and the road to read the weather coming in from the north and west. She did not go there to watch the farm, but she watched it anyway because it was there and because she was human, and because the human mind will direct itself toward familiar things even when it would prefer not to. The chimney of the Hartwell farmhouse was visible on clear days as a line of smoke rising from the valley. In October, it had been moderate afire in the evening, the kitchen stove burning through the day at a working temperature. In November, it had thickened. In December, it changed character entirely. The smoke in December was heavy and irregular pulsing, rather than flowing the thick dark gray of a fire fed with unseasoned or unsuitable wood. She had learned enough in her own weeks of fire management to read what she was seeing. They were burning whatever they had without selection, without economy. The pile of split wood she had seen stacked against the side of the barn in October had been, by her estimate, sufficient for a careful winter. They were not being careful. She stood on the frozen ridge one morning in the middle of December and watched the smoke column rising from the Hartwell chimney and tried to identify what she felt. She expected satisfaction. She had expected it since October, the cold comfort of watching the people who had discarded her discover in some practical and undeniable way that what they had discarded had value. That was the human thing to feel. That was what spite her companion and fuel since she had turned off the road in October was supposed to deliver. What she felt instead was nothing. Not peace, not forgiveness, not the generous emptiness of someone who has moved beyond grievance. Simply nothing, a blank where the feelings should have been, as though the 6 years in that house had taken something from her that was still missing some capacity for the emotion that the moment was supposed to produce. Edna Hartwell's fire was struggling, and Clara Voss felt nothing about it, and the nothingness frightened her more than the cold had frightened her because she did not know what it meant about what had been done to her. She went back to the hollow and built a small, clean fire, and she cooked a piece of root in the tin cup and she ate it slowly, and she thought about the nothingness for a long time without arriving at any conclusion about it. She did not go back to the Overlook for a week. January arrived with the weight of a verdict. The temperature on the worst nights dropped to 20 below. The creek froze solid except for 3 small sections where springs fed it from the hillside, and she marked those sections carefully, knowing them as the only water available during the worst of it. The deer had vanished into the deepest cover, and the squirrels had gone silent, and even the crows, usually reliable residents of the ridge throughout the winter, were absent for days at a time, as though they had made a collective decision to wait out the worst somewhere more hospitable. She had almost nothing left. On the worst days, she had a handful of walnut meat and a piece of dried root no larger than 2 fingers. She drank water constantly to fill the space the food was supposed to occupy, and she moved slowly, conserving, not wasting heat on exertion that wasn't necessary, not leaving the hollow until a task demanded it, and returning as soon as the task was complete. She had known hunger before. The Hartwell table had been adequate, rather than generous, and there had been days in those 6 years when she had gone to her palate with less food in her than she needed. But this was different in kind as well as degree. This was the hunger of the body consuming itself, the gradual and systematic liquidation of reserves. She could feel it in her thinking, a slight softening at the edges, a delay between intention and execution, and she recognized this as dangerous and compensated for it by making decisions in the morning, when she was warmest and most alert, and then simply executing them in the afternoon without revisiting them. On the 12th of January, Amos Calloway came up the ridge. She heard him before she saw him, the crunch of snowshoes on crusted snow, a deliberate sound, someone making noise on purpose to avoid surprising whatever might be ahead of them. She opened the bark door and looked out. He was a broad man in his mid-40s, dressed in heavy wool and canvas, a pack on his back, and a rifle slung over one shoulder. He had a dark beard going gray, and the weather-reading eyes of someone who spends most of their time outside and has learned to extract information from sky and ground and tree that other people simply don't know to look for. He stopped when he saw her and looked at her with an expression that was not surprise, exactly more like the confirmation of a hypothesis he had formed some time ago and was now seeing verified. "You're the Hartwell girl," he said, "the one who went into the hills in October." "I'm not anyone's girl," Clara said. "But yes." He looked at the hollow oak, the bark door, the clay-sealed gaps in the trunk, the carefully concealed fire pit to one side. He looked at this arrangement for a long moment in the evaluating way that people who know about practical things look at other practical things and take stock of what has been done well. "That'll hold," he said, meaning the tree, meaning the whole arrangement. "That'll hold through the season. It's held so far." He unslung the pack from his back and set it down in the snow. He had news from the valley, he said. He told her about Howard Hartwell, how the man had gone out during a thaw in the previous week to scout for fallen wood, how the weather had turned back hard without warning, how Howard had gotten turned around in the whiteout and walked in circles until his body stopped. Found him 2 days later, a quarter mile from the house, frozen solid. Clara listened without speaking. "How is she managing?" she asked, and she was surprised to find that she meant it as a genuine question rather than a satisfied one. "Badly," Amos said simply. "Farm's falling apart. 2 of the fences are down and she doesn't have the hands to repair them." He paused. "Then I've got a proposition. I've got a cabin at the lower end of my trap line 3 miles south. More space than I need. You could ride out the rest of the winter there. I'd want someone to cook and I'd pay for it $2 a month." "It's a fair offer." Clara looked at him for a long time. "I know it's fair," she said. He waited. "I'm staying," she said. "I'll come down in the spring." Amos looked at her the way people look at something they don't fully understand but have decided to respect anyway. Not agreement, not disagreement, simply the acknowledgement that a decision has been made by someone with the authority to make it. He reached into the pack and brought out a cloth bag, dried beans, and a small paper twist of salt. He set them in the snow beside the fire pit without ceremony. He did not say, "This is for you," or "I hope this helps," or any of the phrases that turn a kindness into a transaction requiring something in return. He simply set the bag down. Then he shouldered his pack and started back down the ridge. Clara watched him go. She picked up the bag of beans and held it in both hands, feeling the weight of it, and something moved through her chest that was not quite gratitude and not quite grief, but was related to both the recognition that decency existed in the world and that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to encounter it without a condition attached. She went inside and closed the bark door behind her. The worst night came at the end of January. The temperature had dropped through the floor of what she thought of as survivable cold into something that had no precedent in her experience, a cold that was not a sensation so much as a presence, something with weight and intention pressing against the hollow from all sides. The fire that evening had been her best drywood, hot and clean, the stones absorbing maximum heat before she let it burn down to coals, and the hollow was warmer than it had any right to be when she settled into her pine bough bed and pulled the extra dress over her like a second layer. She was almost asleep when she heard the crack. Not the rifle shot of the trees contracting in the cold she had grown familiar with. That sound cataloged it into the ordinary music of winter nights. This was different. A prolonged splintering, close, and then a heavy impact that shook the ground beneath her and sent a pulse of cold air through the bark door. She was outside in 3 seconds. A branch, a limb from the hickory, growing 15 feet to the east of the hollow, the thickness of a man's waist and weighted with 2 months of accumulated ice, had fallen directly across her fire pit. The impact had scattered the banked coals, and several of them had rolled toward the base of the oak, a glowing dull orange in the snow. Two had landed against the bark of the tree itself, and she could see in the darkness the faint ribbon of smoke rising from the wood where the coal touched it. She did not have water. The water in her cup was frozen solid. She used her hands. She picked up the coals one at a time in her bare palms. There were 4, and she got to them in the order of proximity to the tree, the closest ones first, and threw them into the snow, where they hissed and went dark. The last one had been against the bark long enough to char a section the size of her palm, and she packed snow against the char with both hands and held it there until she was certain. Then she sat back in the snow and looked at her hands. The burns were on the inside of both palms, not deep, not the devastating burns of careless contact, but real burns, the kind that blister and weep and make every subsequent action for the next 2 weeks a negotiation between necessity and pain. She packed snow against them and held it and looked up through the bare hickory branches at the stars, which were very bright and very cold and entirely indifferent to her. She was not afraid. She was not grateful to have caught it in time. She was angry. It was a clean and total anger, the kind that comes when you have held everything together with tremendous effort and the world takes a run at your structure anyway, not because you did anything wrong, but simply because that is what the world does. She was angry at the branch and the cold, and the 6 years and the Hartwells, and every person who had ever looked at her and made a calculation about her worth and come up short. She was angry at Edna Hartwell's wooden ruler and Howard Hartwell's eyes fixed on the floor, and the flour sack, and the 50 cents, and the entire arrangement by which some people were permitted to use up other people and call it charity. She sat in the snow with her burned hands packed in cold, and she was furious, and the fury burned cleaner and hotter than any fire she had built in that pit. And when she finally went back inside and settled into her pine bough bed, she was paradoxically warmer than she had been when she left it. Anger, she was discovering, had practical applications. February came, and she was still alive. She took stock. The beans Amos had left were nearly gone, stretched across 3 weeks of careful rationing, a small handful per day boiled in the tin cup, with whatever roots she could still dig from the creek bank where the springs kept the ground from freezing solid. She had 4 squirrel pelts drying on sticks outside the entrance, secured against wind with stones. Her weight loss had stabilized not because she was eating enough, but because her body had found its new operating level and was functioning within it the way a fire adjusts its burn rate to the available fuel. She was cold. She was hungry. She was tired in a way that had become so constant it no longer registered as a condition, but simply as the texture of existence. She was alive. She began in the long hours of February when the cold made outdoor work impossible for more than short stretches to work on the pelts. She had accumulated enough squirrel skins over the course of the winter to construct something, she was not sure what exactly, But she knew she could not walk into Elhorn in March in a dress that had been thin in October and was now held together primarily by habit. She had no needle. She used the tip of the hunting knife to punch holes in the dried pelts and the braided cord from the anonymous bundle, Ruth's cord, though she did not know it yet, to stitch them together in a pattern dictated entirely by the shapes she had available, rather than any design principle. The result was ugly in the specific and honest way of things made purely for function by someone learning as they went. She tried it on inside the hollow, turning in the small space, assessing coverage. It was not beautiful. It was not anything she would have chosen if choice had been available. It was the warmest thing she had ever worn. She stood in the hollow in the coat she had made from animals she had caught herself stitched with cord left by a girl who had been afraid and come anyway, and she felt something shift in her chest that was not warmth exactly and not pride exactly, but was in the neighborhood of both. February ended. She knew it was ending not by any calendar she had lost accurate count of her wall marks, somewhere in the middle of January, when a bad week had blurred into a bad week, but by the quality of the light. February light in Kentucky is different from January light in a way that is subtle and entirely reliable. It comes in at a slightly different angle, carries a slightly different color, and the shadows it makes on the snow are slightly less absolute than the shadows of January. This is not warmth. It is not even the promise of warmth. It is simply information. She received it as such. On what she believed to be the 1st of March, she went to the overlook above the hollow for the first time in weeks and stood in the thin early morning light and looked down at the valley. The Hartwell farm was visible in the clear air. She could see the gaps in the fence line where the rails had been pulled for burning. She could see the barn roof with its section of missing shingles that no one had repaired. She could see the chimney, which was no longer producing the thick, desperate smoke of January. It was producing a thin and ordinary column now, which meant either that they had found wood or that there was less of the family left to heat for. She looked at her hands. The burns had healed into a new layer of skin, tighter and slightly shinier than what had been there before. Beneath them was the old callus from 6 years of Hartwell work. Beneath that, she supposed, was whatever she had started with at 12 years old, though she could no longer quite reach it or remember exactly what it had felt like. She turned her hands over in the early March light and looked at them for a long time. They were not a servant's hands anymore, though they had been that, and the evidence of it was layered into them like tree rings, each year's labor compressed and recorded in the thickening skin. They were not yet anything she had a name for, but they had kept her alive through the worst winter in 20 years, and they were hers, and that was enough. She went back to the hollow and began to prepare to leave it. Part 3, Walking past Rouen. She left on a Thursday. She knew it was Thursday because Amos Calloway had come up the ridge one final time in late February, checking his upper trap line. He said, though, she suspected the trap line was incidental and had told her the date, February 28th. She had marked every day since on the wall of the hollow with careful lines, and on the morning she decided to leave 7 marks stood in a row beside the last group, which made it the 7th of March, 1887, which was a Thursday. She did not know why the day of the week mattered, but she noted it. The preparations for leaving were simpler than the preparations for staying had been, which she found appropriate. She dismantled nothing. The pine bough bed she left in place still lofted, still giving off the faint, resinous smell of hemlock. Needles slowly releasing their oils into the enclosed air. The clay ceiling on the wall she left intact. The stone-lined fire pit outside the entrance she left as she had found it, or nearly the stones now smoke-darkened and settled into the ground from months of use, better arranged than they had been at the start. She took the knife from its shelf. She took the tin cup and the cord and the 50 cents still in their paper fold inside her boot, untouched since October because there had been nothing to spend them on and nowhere to spend them. She looked at the wall with its months of mud marks. She had stopped counting accurately in January, but the marks told a story nonetheless. The dense, careful lines of October and November, the slightly irregular marks of December, when the cold had begun to affect her fine motor control, the gaps, and resumed counts of January and February. A record of endurance written in creek mud on the interior wall of a tree. She thought about smoothing it over. She left it. She pulled the bark door closed behind her for the last time and stood in the early March morning and looked at the hollow oak from the outside. From the outside, it was simply a tree enormous. Ancient, the bark gray and furrowed, and indifferent to the small domestic history that had been conducted within it. The entrance was invisible unless you knew to look for it, the bark door flush with the surrounding surface, the clay seals blending into the natural coloring of old wood. In a season, the pine boughs she had cut for the bed would dry completely, and the leaves would settle and compress, and there would be no reliable evidence that anyone had ever been here. The tree would keep its own counsel. She turned downhill and started walking. The snow was still on the ground in the shaded hollows, but the south-facing slopes had been bare for a week, the exposed earth dark and wet, exhaling the smell of ground that has been frozen for months and is now remembering what it is. The creek was running again in full voice. The ice gone except for isolated plates along the shaded banks, and she stopped at the spring and drank and filled her tin cup and stood up and looked at the sky, which was the pale, clear blue of early March in Kentucky. Not warm, not promising warmth, but no longer threatening. She had lost 15 pounds she had not had to spare. She could feel it in the loose hang of the dress she had put on that morning, her better dress, the one she had kept folded in the flour sack since October, and saved for this, and in a lightness of movement that came not from fitness, but from the reduction of the body to its functional minimum. Her face, when she caught it, reflected in a still section of the creek, was lean, in a way it had not been before, the bones more prominent, the eyes sharper in their sockets. She looked at her reflection for a moment without judgment. Then she looked at the coat she was wearing. She had made it in February during the stretches of days when the weather had been too severe for useful outdoor work, and she had needed something to occupy her hands while she waited. The squirrels she had trapped over the course of the winter using cord snares of her own devising, set along the routes she had observed them traveling, before they went deep into winter cover, had provided in accumulation enough pelts to construct something that was not beautiful, but was definitively warm. She had used the tip of the hunting knife to punch holes in the dried pelts and the braided cord from the anonymous bundle to stitch them together in a pattern dictated entirely by the shape she had available, rather than any design principle. The result was ugly in the specific and honest way of things made purely for function. It was the warmest thing she had ever worn. She walked downhill through the thinning snow with the squirrel coat on her back and the knife in her hand and the 50 cents in her boot, and she walked toward the Hartwell farm because the Hartwell farm was between the ridge and the road, and there was no route to Elkhorn that didn't pass it. She was not going to the Hartwell farm. She was going past it. The distinction, as she had come to understand over the course of that winter, was everything. The farm appeared through the trees as she came down the lower slope, first the barn roof with its missing shingles, then the smokehouse, then the main house with its familiar lines, the porch she had swept every morning for 6 years, the kitchen window she had looked out of 10,000 times while her hands were occupied with tasks that belonged to someone else's life. The fence gaps were worse than they had looked from the ridge. 3 entire sections of the east fence were gone, the posts still standing, but the rails pulled, and the ground around the missing sections was trampled in the churn way of livestock that have discovered an opening and used it repeatedly. The kitchen garden was still under snow, but she could see from its edges that it had not been properly put to bed in the fall, the bean poles still standing, the dead vines still wound around them, the work that should have been done in October left undone because the person who had always done it was not there to do it. She came out of the tree line at the south corner of the property and walked along the fence line toward the road. Edna Hartwell was in the yard. She was standing at the well working the handle of the pump with both hands, her back partly turned. She was wearing her good wool coat and her good boots, both of which told Clara something about the state of the household, that Edna was doing the outdoor work herself now, in her good clothes because there was no one else, and because she had not yet fully accepted this new arrangement. The bucket at the base of the pump was large, a dairy bucket, built for volume, and when it was full, it would be heavy in a way that Edna Hartwell, 62 years old and unaccustomed to carrying weight, was going to find difficult. Clara walked along the fence line. She was 20 feet from the gate when Edna turned. The woman turned the way you turn when a peripheral movement registers in the corner of your vision and your nervous system responds before your conscious mind has processed what it's seeing. She turned and she saw Clara. The squirrel skin coat, the bark and hide wrappings on her feet, the lean sharpness of a face that had been reduced to its essentials by 5 months of winter, and she went absolutely still. The pump handle was still moving from its last stroke, the residual momentum carrying it forward and back once before it settled. Edna Hartwell's mouth opened. Nothing came out. She had expected Clara to be dead. Clara could see it in her face with a clarity that required no interpretation, not guilt exactly, not the look of someone confronting a wrong they had committed, but the specific blankness of a person whose accounting of the world has been contradicted by a fact they cannot immediately incorporate. Clara Voss had been sent into the hills with 50 cents in October, and it was now March, and here she was walking along the fence line in a coat made of animals. She had caught herself alive in a way that seemed, by the evidence of Edna Hartwell's expression, entirely unreasonable. Clara met her eyes. She did not stop walking. She had thought about this moment. Through the long January nights, she had imagined it many times, what she would say, what expression she would wear, whether she would stop and speak or walk past in silence. She had composed speeches in her mind during the worst hours, the late-night hours, when the cold was at its most serious, and the anger burned clearest speeches that enumerated precisely what had been taken from her and what it had cost and what she thought of the person who had taken it. The speeches were satisfying to compose. They were true. Every word of them was true. She had abandoned them all somewhere in February. Not because she had forgiven anything. Forgiveness was a different transaction entirely, and she was not conducting it. She had abandoned the speeches because she had understood, lying in her pine bough bed, listening to the January cold work on the trees, that delivering those words to Edna Hartwell would require her to stand in front of Edna Hartwell and wait for a response. And waiting for a response meant that Edna Hartwell's response still had the power to matter. And she had spent 5 months in a hollow tree specifically so that Edna Hartwell's assessment of her would never matter again. The most complete thing she could say to this woman was nothing. So she said nothing. She was through the gate and onto the road when she heard the second voice. Ruth. Ruth Hartwell came around the corner of the house at something close to a run, her skirts gathered in one hand, her face flushed from cold or exertion or both. She was 17 now. She had turned 17 in January, and Clara knew this because she had marked the date on the wall of the hollow without quite deciding why one small mud mark among the others, a private acknowledgement of a birthday she had no way to celebrate and no reason to ignore. Clara, she said, and then when Clara kept walking, please. Clara stopped. She did not turn around immediately. She stood on the road with her back to the farm, and something moving in her chest that was not the cold coal of spite and not grief and not forgiveness, but was something in between all of those things, some complicated alloy of them, and she breathed once slowly and then she turned. Ruth was at the gate, one hand on the post, looking at Clara with the expression of someone who has rehearsed something important and is now discovering that rehearsal and performance are different things. She was still the girl Clara had watched from 6 years of proximity, the soft manner, the uncertainty of someone accustomed to the world arranging itself around her preferences. But there was something different in her now. Some new texture in the uncertainty, the texture of someone who has recently understood something about themselves that they did not previously know and are not comfortable with the understanding. I left the food, Ruth said. Last November, I left the salt pork and the cord. I wanted to come back again, but she stopped. I was afraid she'd find out. I was afraid of what she'd say. Clara looked at her. She thought about the bundle at the base of the oak, the careful portion enough for one person calculated correctly. The braided cord she had used to stitch the squirrel coat, which was on her back right now, which had kept her warm through every night since February. Ruth had climbed this ridge alone in November snow and left something at the base of a tree and not stayed to be thanked or acknowledged or absolved, and then she had gone back down and said nothing to anyone. She was afraid, Clara thought, and she came anyway. There is a difference between people who are afraid and do nothing and people who are afraid and do the small possible thing anyway. Clara had spent 5 months learning the difference from the inside. She recognized it now from the outside. I know it was you, Clara said. Ruth's eyes were red at the edges. I'm sorry, it wasn't more. I'm sorry I should have done more. I should have said something before they... Clara held up one hand, not a dismissal, a stop, the kind that means I have heard enough to answer and the rest is not necessary. The cord held, she said. She looked at Ruth steadily, with the full attention of someone who has been deciding for some time exactly how much of themselves to give back to a world that had not always deserved it. It held all winter. Ruth looked at her for a moment, and something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, not absolution, but something quieter than both. An acknowledgement received. A thing that had needed completing, completed. Clara nodded once. Then she turned and walked toward Elhorn. She did not look back. She did not need to. She had said what was true and meant it, and that was sufficient. She was not Ruth Hartwell's forgiveness to give or withhold. She was not Edna Hartwell's judgment to administer. She was a woman walking down a road in March with a knife and 50 cents and a coat she had made herself, and Elhorn was 4 miles south and she had work to do. The road ran south along the valley floor following the creek that came down from the ridge. The world on either side of it was showing its first tentative signs of spring, not warmth, not green, but a loosening, a general relaxation of the grip that winter had kept on everything since November. The mud at the road's edge was mud and not ice. A red-winged blackbird called once from a thicket of last year's canes and went silent. The sky was high and clear, and the sun, though not warm, was present in a way that January sun was not present. She had been in the world for 5 months with no one watching. She was going back into it now, and she was not the same person who had left it. The town of Elhorn sat at a crossroads in the valley floor, a collection of perhaps 30 buildings arranged along 2 intersecting roads with the unplanned logic of settlements that grew from practical need rather than civic intention. There was a general store, a feed merchant, a sawmill on the creek at the eastern edge of town, a Baptist church, a boarding house, a smithy, and a scattering of residential structures in varying states of maintenance. It was not a large town. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the arrival of a young woman in a squirrel skin coat, walking in from the North Road on a March morning, was noted from at least 4 windows before she reached the main intersection. She went to the general store first. The storekeeper was a man named Silas Crawford, 60s, spare with the economical manner of someone who has spent decades conducting transactions and has reduced all human interaction to its commercial essentials without becoming unkind in the process. He looked at Clara when she came in, looked at the squirrel coat, looked at her face, and returned to the account book he had been working in without visible reaction. She placed the 50 cents on the counter. He looked at it. "Cornmeal," she said, "and whatever fishing line that buys if there's any left over." He measured out the cornmeal in silence. There was 70 cents worth at current prices, which meant the fishing line was not possible, and he told her this without apology. She nodded and took the cornmeal. She was at the door when he said, without looking up from the account book, "Sawmill's looking for a cook. Day workers need feeding. $1 a week room in the outbuilding." She stood in the doorway. "Who do I talk to?" "You're talking to him," Silas Crawford said. She started the following Monday. The sawmill employed 14 men during the cutting season, fallers and haulers, and the mill workers themselves who ran the equipment from first light to last, and required feeding twice a day at mid-morning and at the end of the shift in quantities proportional to the work they were doing, which was very large quantities indeed. The kitchen was a separate structure beside the main mill building, built for function with no concessions to comfort, equipped with a cast iron stove, a long work table shelving, and a door that faced the mill yard so that food could be called done and collected without ceremony. Clara cooked for 14 men 312 days of her first year. She was paid every Friday a silver dollar placed on the work table by Silas Crawford, who managed the payroll as he managed everything else without elaboration. The first Friday she stood at the work table after he had gone and looked at the coin for a long time. It was not a large amount of money. It was not enough to do most of the things that money does in the world. But it was hers, earned by work she had chosen and compensated at a rate she had agreed to, and no one had told her she was lucky to receive it, and no one had placed a ruler in a drawer beside the stove. She picked it up and put it in her boot next to the paper fold that had held 50 cents since October and was now empty. She replaced the 50 cents with $1. The 50 cents she kept separately in the small cloth bag that had held her mother's last possessions. She would keep them her entire life. They were not a souvenir of suffering. They were a reminder of the specific arithmetic of being discarded, and she found that the reminder was useful not to maintain bitterness, which is expensive, and ultimately self-defeating, but to maintain clarity about what things were actually worth and who actually got to decide. In her second week at the sawmill, Amos Calloway came in to purchase lumber for a cabin addition. She was kneading bread dough at the work table when he came through the kitchen door. He had gotten into the habit of cutting through the kitchen on his way to the lumberyard, which was technically not permitted, but which Silas Crawford had never addressed, possibly because Amos Calloway spent more money at the mill than almost anyone else in the county. He stopped when he saw Clara at the work table. He looked at her for a moment. The squirrel coat was on its hook by the door. She was wearing a plain work dress she had purchased with her second week's wages, and her hair was pulled back, and she was covered in flour to the elbows. "You made it," he said. She kept kneading. "You left good beans," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has registered a satisfactory outcome and has nothing further to add to the subject. He went through to the lumberyard. She shaped the bread and set it to rise. She saved every dollar that was not immediately necessary. This took a particular kind of discipline, not the dramatic discipline of endurance which she had demonstrated over a winter in a hollow tree, but the quiet, sustained discipline of small, consistent choices made in the absence of any immediate pressure to make them. She did not spend money on things that were not necessary. She ate what the sawmill provided. She wore clothes until they were genuinely unwearable and replaced them with the cheapest functional alternative. She did not drink. She did not gamble. She did not spend money on comfort because comfort, she had found, was not what she was working toward. She was working toward land. The idea had come to her fully formed on a morning in April of that first year when she had walked up the South Road before first light and stood at the edge of town and looked up at the ridge above the valley. The ridge was visible in the early morning light, the tree line dark against the pale sky, and somewhere up there in the hollow of an old oak tree were the mud marks she had made on a wall through the worst winter of her life. She wanted to own the ground she stood on. Not the hollow, the tree was not hers to own, and she would not have wanted to own it even if she could. You don't try to own the thing that carried you across deep water. You honor it, and you remember it, and you let it be what it is. But the ridge, a piece of the ridge that she could hold in her own name, that no court and no family and no woman with a wooden ruler could remove from her, that would be hers in the legal and irrevocable sense that the word yours is supposed to mean but so rarely does for people who start with nothing. She asked Silas Crawford about land prices in the county. He told her without asking why she wanted to know, which she appreciated. She did the arithmetic every Friday night, adding the new dollar to the accumulated sum she kept track of in her head, with the precision of someone for whom every dollar is a specific and irreplaceable object. 3 years and 2 months at $1 a week with no interruption would get her to what Crawford had estimated was the minimum purchase price for a small parcel on the ridge above a town, rough land, steep without water improvements, not the kind of ground a farmer would want. Exactly the kind of ground a woman who had lived in a tree would know precisely what to do with. She worked her 3 years and 2 months. She bought the land in the spring of 1890. The parcel was 11 acres on the eastern slope of the ridge above Elkhorn, not the hollow where the oak stood, but the adjacent slope close enough that she could walk to the oak in a half hour on a clear morning. The deed was filed at the county clerk's office on a Tuesday afternoon in April, and when the clerk handed her the paper copy with the official seal pressed into the bottom right corner, she stood at the counter and read it through twice. Clara Voss, party of the first part, in fee simple, 11 acres. She folded it with care and put it in her coat. She walked back to the sawmill. She started dinner. The cabin took 2 years to build, working in the hours before and after her shifts at the mill on Sundays, and during the brief suspension of the cutting season each winter, when Silas Crawford closed the mill for repairs. She had no formal knowledge of construction. She had the natural history book's descriptions, which she remembered with accuracy, and she had 2 years of watching the sawmill's construction crew repair and modify the mill buildings. And she had the understanding, confirmed absolutely by 5 months in a hollow tree, that a structure's primary obligation is to maintain the temperature of its interior against the temperature of its exterior, and that this obligation is met through the quality of walls, the placement of openings, and the management of heat. She built good walls. She built them thick the way the oak's walls had been thick, not from any formal building knowledge, but from the bone-deep understanding of what thickness meant, what it kept out, what it held in. She built a chimney that drew clean and a roof that shed water and a door that closed flush against its frame without a gap. She built a single south-facing window that let the winter sun reach the interior of the main room for 4 hours each afternoon, warming the floor and the wall behind it in the way that the oak tree had warmed its hollow, passively, reliably, without requiring anything but presence. The cabin had 3 rooms and a covered porch and a root cellar dug into the slope behind it where the temperature stayed constant through both summer and winter. On the first night she spent in it, a night in the late autumn of 1892, the November cold beginning to assert itself in the hills. In its familiar way, she built a fire in the hearth and sat in the chair she had made from green wood and rope and watched the fire until the room was fully warm. Then she took Ezra Malone's hunting knife from the flour sack where she had kept it since March of 1887, and she placed it on the mantel above the hearth. She looked at it for a long time. She had kept the knife for 5 years in a cloth bag, carried it every day, used it for cooking and work and the 100 small cutting tasks that daily life requires. But she had never placed it anywhere permanent. It had lived in the bag mobile, unassigned, as though she were not yet certain enough of her location to give anything a permanent home. Placing it on the mantel was a different thing. It meant she was not leaving. It meant the knife had found its permanent location because she had found hers. It meant that the old man who had walked away into the forest in October of 1886 and not come back out was being honored in the only way she knew how, to honor someone by being present in the place they had helped make possible by staying. When staying was the harder choice, by building something that would outlast the gratitude and become simply real. She sat in her chair in her cabin on her land, and she watched the fire. Edna Hartwell died in April of 1899. She died in the upstairs room of the Elhorn boarding house, the same boarding house she had directed Clara toward on the morning of October 1886, run now by a different widow than the one whose name Clara had never known. Edna had sold the farm in 1894 for less than it was worth to a family from Tennessee who had repaired the fences and replaced the barn roof and returned the property to productive order within 2 seasons. She had moved to the boarding house with the proceeds and lived there for 5 years in the reduced circumstances of someone who believed until quite recently that reduced circumstances were things that happened to other people. She was 65 years old. She had no one to arrange her burial. The boarding house widow came to the sawmill on a Thursday morning and spoke to Silas Crawford, and Silas Crawford came to the kitchen where Clara was making breakfast for the morning shift and told her what had happened with the same economical delivery he applied to all information. Clara turned the bacon in the pan. She thought about 6 years. She thought about 50 cents. She thought about a wooden ruler in a drawer beside a stove and the sound of thin Bible paper turning in a morning kitchen while bruises were still fresh on her arms. She thought about all of this, and she finished turning the bacon, and she said, "I'll pay for the box." Crawford looked at her. "A pine box and a proper burial," she said. "I'll pay for it." He nodded and went back to the mill. She did not attend the funeral. It was a small service, the boarding house widow and 2 women from the Baptist church who attended funerals as a matter of principle, regardless of the deceased. Ruth Hartwell, who had married a farmer in the next county and moved away in 1891, did not come back for it. The minister said what ministers say over people who have not given him much particular material to work with. The town talked about who had paid for the burial for approximately 1 week, which was the standard duration for Elhorn conversations about anything. Several people asked Clara directly. She gave the same answer each time in the same tone she used to describe weather or lumber prices. "She fed me for 6 years," she said. "That buys her a pine box." Nothing more. People who heard this reported afterward that it was impossible to tell from her tone whether it was an act of generosity or an act of accounting, and Clara, when this characterization reached her, did not correct it because she had decided that the ambiguity was the point. Edna Hartwell had reduced her to a transaction once. Clara Voss was returning the favor at exactly face value, not a penny more, not a penny less. It was, she had decided, the most honest thing she could do. The years after Edna's burial were quieter in the way that years become quiet when the things that drove you have been resolved and you are left with only the life you built for yourself from the raw material of surviving them. Clara continued to work at the sawmill. She had become, by the mid-1890s, something more than a cook, something closer to the operational center of the place, the person who knew where everything was and what everyone needed and how to manage the daily logistics of feeding and supplying 14 men through seasons that made different demands on the operation. Silas Crawford raised her wage 3 times without being asked. She accepted each raise with the same expression she had accepted the first dollar quiet present, not performing gratitude that would have embarrassed both of them. She planted a kitchen garden on the south slope below her cabin, the first garden that was ever hers to tend for her own purposes rather than someone else's. She grew what she needed and more than she needed because after years of calculating exactly enough, it gave her something close to pleasure to look at shelves of preserved food in October and know that the winter could come and she was ready for it and had been ready for months. She kept a small flock of chickens in a coop she built behind the cabin, and every morning when she went out before dawn to feed them, she was aware in some part of herself that didn't require articulation that she was doing the same task she had done for 6 years in someone else's house, and that it was an entirely different act when the chickens were hers. The ridge above Elhorn became in the way that places become things Voss Ridge. Not officially, at first, there was no official mechanism for such things, but in the ordinary speech of the town, in the directions people gave, and the landmarks they used, and the way a place gets named by accumulated reference rather than formal designation. People began to say up on Voss Ridge the way they said down at the creek, meaning a place that had always been there and had been what it was for longer than anyone could quite remember. Clara heard it said the first time and felt nothing in particular about it. She heard it said 100 more times over the following years and came to understand gradually that it was not a tribute or an honor, but simply the accurate record of a fact she had been there. First she had stayed, she had made the place what it was by her presence in it. And the world had registered this in the way that worlds register such things not with ceremony, but with language, with the small, practical adjustment of calling a thing what it is. She had claimed nothing. She had simply not left. The lightning came in June of 1926. She was 58 years old and she was sitting on the cabin porch in the early evening when the storm came in from the northwest. Fast the way serious storms move in the hills, the sky going from clear to green-yellow in less time than it takes to decide whether to go inside. She went inside. The storm was severe and brief, the kind that announces itself with 1 or 2 decisive strikes before settling into ordinary rain, and she heard the crack that was different from the others. The sustained splintering sound she recognized after a moment as a very large tree receiving a direct strike. She knew which tree. She went up the ridge the next morning alone in the early light before the ground had dried from the rain. The path to the hollow was one she had walked so many times in 39 years that her feet knew it without direction, and she arrived at the hollow to find the great oak lying on its side, the root mass torn partly free from the earth, the trunk split open along its length where the lightning had traveled down through the heartwood and found the hollow interior and expanded explosively in the confined space. The tree was down. The cavity that had been her home for 5 months in the winter of 1886 was open to the sky for the first time in centuries. She stood beside the split trunk and looked into it, the walls she had sealed with clay, mostly gone now, but still traceable in the darkened lines where the mortar had sat for 40 years. The floor of the hollow, exposed and open, showed layers of compressed organic material, 40 years of leaf fall since she had left it, and below that, still faintly recognizable in their structure, the dried gray fiber of the pine boughs she had laid in October of 1886. She looked for the wall marks. The section of interior wall she had used for her calendar was still intact in the lower portion of the split trunk. She found it after searching for 10 minutes. The mud marks faded almost entirely, but present if you knew to look for them, the diagonal slashes through the groups of 7 still faintly legible in the dark wood. She stood and looked at those marks for a long time. 40 years. 40 winters since she had made those marks one day at a time in creek mud with a sharpened stick. She had survived every one of them. The valley below had changed: new families, new buildings, roads that hadn't existed in 1886. The sawmill expanded twice and a proper school built on the South Road. And she had watched all of it from the ridge, from the cabin she had built with her own hands on the land she had bought with money she had earned, and none of it had touched her in the way the Hartwells had touched her because she had arranged her life carefully and deliberately so that nothing could. Then she looked at the entrance. The bark door she had made in October of 1886 was still there. 40 years in the protected alcove of the entrance had been kind to it, kinder than she had any right to expect. The bark had dried and contracted and split along its grain lines, and the braided cord that had hinged it was gone, entirely dissolved back into the earth decades ago. But the bark itself was still recognizable in its shape. The rough rectangle she had pried from the dead elm downslope, now silver gray and fragile, resting against the interior wall of the entrance alcove where it had fallen at some point in the last 40 years when the cord gave way. She picked it up carefully, both hands, the way you handle something that has already survived more than it had any right to, and may not survive one careless moment more. It held together. She stood there for a long time holding it. The bark was silver gray and split along its grain, and it weighed almost nothing. 40 years of drying had taken everything from it except its shape. But the shape was right. The rough rectangle she had pried from the dead elm in October of 1886 was still recognizable as what it had been: a door. The first door she had ever chosen for herself. The first threshold she had ever controlled on her own terms without asking anyone's permission. She thought about this girl who had hung this piece of bark on twisted vine in the dark, working by feel because she couldn't afford to waste tallow on a candle, pressing clay into the gaps with cold, stiffened fingers, testing the cord a dozen times in the October cold. Open, open, closed, feeling for the first time in 6 years that she was on the correct side of a door. That girl had not known she would survive. She had only known she was not going back. Clara Voss, 58 years old, standing in a June morning on a ridge in eastern Kentucky with a piece of bark in her hands, understood that she had been carrying this door with her for 40 years without knowing it. Not the bark had stayed in the tree where she left it. The door itself, the principle of it, the understanding of what it meant to choose your own threshold and stand on the right side of it and pull it closed behind you. Some things you carry without knowing you're carrying them. Some things only show themselves when they fall. She carried the bark down the ridge and put it in the wooden box on the mantel beside Ezra Malone's knife, and she closed the lid. The morning of December the 4th, 1931, Nora Finch closes her notebook. She has not written much in it. 3 pages, perhaps 4 of notes taken while Clara Voss talked, but the notes are incomplete, and she knows that what has happened in this cabin over the past 2 hours is not something that transfers easily into the columns of a county newspaper. Not because it is too complicated, but because it is too simple. It is the story of a person who refused to stop being a person when the world found it convenient to treat her as something less. And that story does not require embellishment or analysis. It requires only telling, and it has been told. Clara sits in her chair by the fire. She has not moved much during the telling. The same quality of stillness she has maintained throughout the stillness of someone for whom the interior life is so fully inhabited that the exterior has become quiet by comparison. She is 63 years old, and she has the face of a woman who has been outside in all weathers for most of her life. The lines deep and specific, recording not age exactly, but use the record of a face that has been turned into wind and sun and cold for decades, and has not tried to shield itself from any of it. Nora looks at the mantel, the knife worn thin, the wooden box closed. She does not ask about them. What do you want people to know, she asks instead. When they read this, what do you want them to take from it? Clara is quiet for a long moment. She looks at the fire. She looks at the knife. She looks at some middle distance that is not the cabin and not the past exactly, but the intersection of the two, where memory lives in an old person who has had time to sort through it and decide what it means. Then she says, the tree didn't save me. She says it simply, without drama, without the weight of a person delivering a lesson. The way you say things you have known for a long time and no longer need to perform. I saved myself. The tree just stood still long enough for me to figure that out. Nora writes this down. Clara watches her write it. Then she says quieter, the people who threw me away, they didn't know what they were throwing. I didn't know either. Not until I had to find out. She pauses. That's the thing about being discarded. Either it finishes you or you find out what you are actually made of. There isn't a middle ground. You find out or you don't. She stops speaking. Nora looks at her notebook. She looks at the fire. She looks at the knife on the mantel and the closed wooden box beside it, and she understands, in the way you sometimes understand things before you have the words for them, that the box contains something that was ordinary once and is precious now, not because its material value changed, but because of what it survived and what surviving it required of the person who made it. She gathers her coat and her notebook and stands to go. At the door, she stops. The ridge, she says. People call it Voss Ridge now. Did you know that I named it, Clara says without turning from the fire. Nora waits. She opens the door. The cold comes in for one moment, the same December cold that has always come to this ridge, the same cold that came to a hollow tree 45 years ago and found a girl inside who had decided not to die, and then the door closes. Clara Voss sits in her chair by the fire. Outside, the December frost is doing what it has always done in these hills, settling over the ridge, over the bare oaks, over the frozen creek and the silent tree line, and the place on the slope above town where a 300-year-old tree has been lying in pieces since June and slowly giving itself back to the ground it grew from for 3 centuries. It is settling over Elhorn and over the Hartwell property run now by a family whose youngest daughter was not yet born when Clara Voss walked past the front gate with a squirrel coat on her back and nothing in her hands. It is settling over everything with the patient indifference of something that has been doing this for longer than anyone can remember, and expects to keep doing it long after the people below have finished their various struggles and come to whatever conclusions their struggles require. Clara Voss does not look cold. She looks like a woman who made her arrangements with winter a long time ago and has not needed to renegotiate the terms since. She is warm. She has been warm for a long time. She intends to remain so.